So Kate, please go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to everyone who's still here, and thank you again to our hosts. So I'm going to try and keep this brief because I know we are well past time. But I do want to spend kind of a little time summarizing the paper because I imagine most people didn't quite get through the whole thing. And basically what I'm talking about here are intermediaries, which are a pervasive feature of most modern economies, or at least many modern economies, and this is particularly true in the capital markets. So there's very good reason that they are pervasive as they are. Relying on specialized intermediaries gives rise to a whole host of efficiencies. It can help overcome information asymmetries. It can help with the verification of information. It can help bring parties together. So we have a nice body of literature that looks at the very efficiencies that arise from our reliance on intermediaries. Nonetheless, given just how pervasive they are, I've become interested in the question of whether there are other consequences that arise from the fact we rely so heavily on them. And the paper you have before you is kind of my second piece in this broader project of trying to understand what it means that at least kind of in the US and some of the contexts I'm talking about, we do rely so heavily on intermediaries. And my focus here is on the more narrow question of how the presence of intermediaries affect the dynamic processes through which institutions evolve over time. And my basic claim is quite simple, and that is intermediaries do affect those processes, and they do so in self-serving ways. And this is significant because the fees that intermediaries enjoy are, of course, transaction costs as we traditionally think about them. So this actually has welfare implications beyond just kind of how the gains from trade are allocated. And of course, this claim then runs contrary to the conventional wisdom, which of course has been told us before, that institutions are going to evolve, or market forces at least, will lead institutions to evolve in ways that minimize the associated transaction costs. So where my analysis gets a little bit messy is that I'm not claiming that there's a single mechanism through which intermediaries manage to exercise this influence. Instead, what I want to suggest is that there are a bundle of advantages that intermediaries enjoy with sufficient regularity that they are very often in a position to be able to exercise this influence over the evolution of institutional forms. And there are a couple of different flavors for those advantages. First, there are some strategic advantages. And oftentimes these arise from the very fact that intermediaries are the repeat players. They are the experts in the relevant markets. So this gives them, first, informational advantages. They oftentimes understand the product and the markets in which it trades better than the parties they serve, and oftentimes even better than regulators. And they oftentimes also develop what I call positional advantages. So for example, oftentimes the most efficient way to trade a good is to create a common database or a common centralized exchange. Well, this might be created for efficiency-based reasons. It allows intermediaries to more effectively meet with one another, reduces the overall cost of trading in the good. Nonetheless, intermediaries, once they've created that exchange or the database, have control over it, and they will use that control in self-serving ways. Second, and separately, are collective action dynamics. So any institutional arrangement is going to be a collective good, both from the perspective of the intermediaries and from the perspective of the parties they serve. So you have all the challenges that come along with that. You have incentives to free ride, you have problems of coordination. And my second claim is that intermediaries are often in a better position relative to the parties they serve to overcome those various challenges. So I want to look at this using a quick example to try to illustrate what I'm talking about. And I'm actually going to use an example that's not in the paper, though of course I'm happy to talk about any of the ones that are in the paper. And that is the market for US corporate bonds. So US corporate bonds are generally traded in over-the-counter transactions. So if you wanted, and up until kind of the late 1990s, this was a very opaque market. So if you're an investor and you want to buy or sell a corporate bond, or if you even want to figure out what the price is of a bond that you already own, you're going to have to call one of a small number of dealers that specialize in that bond, and you're going to get a quote that might or might not be binding. This changed in 2001 in a series of different kind of implementation of a system called Trace that effectively requires post-trade disclosure. So now, within 15 minutes of any trade, the dealer that engages in the trade or helps make the transaction happen has to report the price, the bond, and certain other information to the self-regulatory organization, and that self-regulatory organization immediately makes certain of that information public. Immediately after this new system was implemented, there was a clear decline in the spreads and the transaction costs associated with trading corporate bonds. So there are a couple of different studies done. All of them found a decline. One, for example, looked at insurance companies, who are some of the biggest buyers and sellers of these bonds, and they found the decline on average of 5 to 8 basis points. That might not sound like much until you realize that that is actually a 50% decline in the trading costs for corporate bonds. And if you look at the volume of bonds generally bought and sold in a year, that's $1 billion annually. So there are significant transaction cost savings from this change. And the change occurred because of a rule adopted by the SRO. So it would have been entirely possible for the market to be able, market participants, through their control over that SRO, to implement this change. Nonetheless, this did not come about as a result of any market forces. It happened only after there was significant policy pressure from policymakers. So the House actually passed a bill that was going to mandate post-trade disclosure, and I think it was Arthur Levitt, then chairman of the SEC, effectively instructed the SRO, you have to adopt these types of rules, and of course that's when they finally got put into place. And notably, this is true even though, as I alluded to earlier, the buyers and sellers of corporate bonds are oftentimes insurance companies. They're mutual funds. These are otherwise very sophisticated buyers. So it's not that we are talking about a situation where you have unsophisticated parties. You had sophisticated parties. Nonetheless, the market itself didn't make this change until we had this policy intervention. The question is why? And of course, my answer is intermediary influence. So we can look a little bit at the bond dealers that were involved. First, we can look at the strategic advantages. Start with the informational advantages. Again, the theory and the empirical evidence that was available strongly suggested that if you made this change, you should see a decline in spreads. That's why the House passed the bill they did. That's why the SEC was creating this pressure. Nonetheless, there was at least one theory out there that suggested there was the possibility you would actually get greater spreads, and the evidence wasn't necessarily conclusive. Who had the information that you would need to be able to make more accurate and more meaningful assessments of what the probable effects were going to be were, of course, all the dealers. They knew what their spreads were. They knew what the depth of liquidity tended to be in these very bonds, and they had every incentive to either withhold that information or to make it publicly available only in ways that tended to favor entrenchment of the current regime. Second, they had positional advantages, and these took a couple of forms. So most obviously, they had control over the relevant SRO, and they weren't going to use that control in a way that moved away from a system that allowed them to profit so handsomely. But second, they also had kind of an informal network of relationships among the dealers and also between the dealers and their clients. So even though this new regime resulted in slightly more effective pricing, there was not a situation where you could have an upstart actually creating an alternative regime that would have anywhere near the liquidity of the current regime. Those relationships and that network was such that you couldn't have probably what I consider kind of disruptive innovation coming in, and that gave them the ability to make it so any change was likely going to have to go through what was already the system in place. And then apart from that, we have, of course, collective action dynamics. So collective action, we have a dispersed group on both sides, potentially, but a far greater ability to get over the diffuse group of interest when we look at the dealers involved. So, as we just mentioned, they are all part of the SRO, and this is quite common. So oftentimes you see intermediaries, if they're not part of a self-regulatory organization, there's often a trade group or something like that in place. So they are members of these groups for individualized reasons. They wanted to have access, they were required to be members, but nonetheless, once that group exists, it is a very effective tool that can be used to promote their collective interests. And second, at least at this time, there were basically 5 or 6 dealers that did the great majority of the business. And this, of course, changes the calculation in a couple of ways. First, 5 or 6 people, it's a lot easier to coordinate what you're doing. And second, if you have a small number of players, each of them captures a much greater share of the rents or other benefits of a particular arrangement. So if I know I'm getting 20% of the arrangement, I have greater individualized reasons to try to promote the entrenchment of that than if we talk about a situation even here where we have very sophisticated investors. They were all still very small relative to the overall portion of the market, so their individual incentives look very different. And of course, my claim in the paper is that the dynamics I just described are in no way specific to the market for corporate bonds, but rather kind of a pervasive set of features that arise very often when we rely on specialized intermediaries. I could go through a lot more of the examples or the policy implications, but I want to kind of limit myself to just a couple of things. So first, there are clear implications for theory. Even though there are a whole variety of ideas out there, from path dependence, agency costs, collusion, we know there are a variety of market failures that prevent the market from necessarily achieving efficient outcomes. And I think a lot of what I'm talking about overlaps a lot with a lot of those theories. Nonetheless, by starting with a different point of actually looking at a group of particular market actors who are engaged in a particular action, we can come together to actually see what I think is a persistent market force pushing in a different direction. So it allows us to see slightly differently how even the market forces themselves are not just in certain circumstances, but rather going to consistently push in a direction that's something other than a quick road towards an efficient outcome. And of course, I think when you have that, you also have policy implications. And here, I'm not talking about regulators going in, starting from scratch and saying, here's what it looks like an ideal market should look like, and kind of in a top-down way trying to push that. But I think echoing a theme that comes through a lot of my work is there's a lot of different market forces out there. Some of them are pushing towards more efficient arrangements, and some of them are actually pushing in other directions. And so I think a key role for regulation is figuring out how to help or aid the expression of those market forces that are leading towards more efficient outcomes, and help them have greater expression, and impede kind of the expression of these other forces that are leading in opposite directions. And I'd also say, along with that, that among the benefits is there are also a lot of collateral consequences. So not only are these inefficient, but I mean, again, the trace example illustrates that there you have less accurate pricing, you end up with less ability to be able to figure out what these things are worth. So there are, I think, a variety of collateral consequences that also arise that merit consideration and help to justify, again, relatively mild, but nonetheless meaningful intervention.
Well, first I would like to thank Bruno and Mariana to invite me to comment Kate's paper about intermediaries. I learned a lot about it. And I will try to give some insights from the Brazilian reality to discuss or give some elements to think about these intermediaries' influence. But before starting with my comments, I have 2 points I would like to highlight about the Brazilian market or a Brazilian agenda. The paper main issue, intermediaries influencing the institutional arrangements that guarantee the maximization of their fees, is not exactly the most important issue in Brazilian capital market agenda. I don't mean that it isn't important, but we have a lot of other challenges to develop our market. And for example, we are trying to create the stock market for small and medium firms here in Brazil. We need the improvement of the secondary market to bonds. We don't have it, liquidity in the bonds. We're trying to improve the enforcement mechanisms to guarantee an efficient secondary market without fraud. So we have a lot of things before think about the influence of intermediaries, but it is also important. And another point is that the role of law here in Brazil when we talk about capital market. If we look to Brazilian capital market regulations history, we find that the law is also considered an interesting instrument to create and to develop in the market. To demonstrate that, we could mention the fiscal incentives from the 60s or the private regulation initiatives for the creation of the special corporate levels at BMF Bovespa. So that's not a matter just to give more information or influence to not allow to do something. To create the market something important. Having this in mind, I will start with my comments. Since the paper uses examples to build its argument, I'll give some Brazilian examples maybe to contribute or to give another element to think about this influence. The first situation is related to international regulation, as we talked yesterday. If we look at the last CVM ordinance that regulates mutual funds, we will find IOSCO principles reference. So CVM justify their activity in some trying to implement international regulation. If we consider this, and we have to consider these international fora to understand the influence of intermediaries, not just in your own country, but how can they play an important role in international fora. And I think this aspect could be addressed in your paper, maybe outside your own system. Even if you tell me that international regulation is not important for American regulation, I think American intermediaries also act in a global market, and sometimes they need to sit in a table with other players. And for this reason, it may be important to consider this for your analysis. The second situation is related to the build of the market for small and medium companies and the role of intermediaries in Brazil. We have, I have a hypothesis that the lack of economic interest from the intermediaries, from the underwriters, from the investment funds, is a barrier to create this market in Brazil. It's not a matter of influence to have high fees arrangement, but it's a matter of I'm not interested in participate in this kind of IPO because I don't. The work is the same as a big one, and I own less, and so I'm not interested in participate. And since it is obligate that underwrite and participate in IPO. We have another problem with the intermediaries. It's not just a matter of have a high fees or is a matter of a lack of economic interest. And what should they do? Just say, no, okay, this IPO will happen without underwriting? It's not possible to do this. So in this situation, the problem is not to promote high fee arrangements. Some institution in the market had the idea to ask for fiscal incentives for the government to participate in these small IPOs. In this sense, the law could have other functions other than promoting transparency or having great interventions. In the third situation, I'm trying to show that you must consider other functions for the intermediaries, considering other interests, for example, anti-money laundering functions. Here in Brazil, the intermediaries sometimes plays an important role for capital market. In Brazil, the brokers should maintain all the clients' information and identify the last beneficiary and be liable for doing so. This is a regulatory choice to facilitate monitoring the capital market. Is not being used for illegal reasons. And so that's not just a matter of having a high fees arrangement. It's another, we're trying to address other function. That's something curious. In your paper, you use just trading intermediaries as example. If we use a post-trade intermediaries like clearings, we find also another function for the intermediaries that guarantee the system. The clearings are the counterpart, and that's not just a matter of high fees arrangement. We're trying to address other roles, other functions. And the fourth situation is related to the stock exchange demutualization process here in Brazil. In 2008, we had the dismutualization of Bovespa and also to BMF Bovespa, the mercantile and future exchange. With this, the brokers have lost their position of the owners of the market organization institution. As a consequence, first, they lost the private enforcement mechanism control. And nowadays, private enforcement mechanisms work much better as an instrument to punish fraud and illegal acts in the secondary market practiced by intermediaries. So that they can have advantage not just with the high fees arrangement, but also from the not efficient arrangement on the environment in capital market. Another consequence is that brokers lost the possibility to establish the fees. Nowadays in Brazil, small brokers are fighting with the stock exchange to survive in the market. So it's not just, the competition is also important to understand. And with this situation, we could think that high fees is not the only way that intermediaries expect to get financial benefits. We can also think that inefficiencies in the market enforcement can also represent an inefficient institutional arrangement that is for the intermediate interests. And intermediaries cannot be considered as a uniform agent, and as I could understand from your paper, this example from the stock exchange and the brokers shows that we can find conflict of interest among intermediaries, and how can we address this? So there's not adjustment. I hope, Kate, with these 4 examples, we can think about in another environment. High fees is not the only way that we should address the intermediaries' influence, and that's it.
One thing that the number $1 billion savings, that the immediate questions that this raises, that we might think about cases in which there is some form of natural monopoly. So you can understand that there is no way for anyone else to create a competitive platform to compete with that group, with the 5 people who are needed. But when you are talking about $1 billion saving, and obviously the clients would like to create a competitive platform, then it raises the question, why is that no one came in? And as we would expect, when you have such huge rents and create a competitive element. Now, that's the second point is the flip side of this, and that some of those intermediaries, their positive side is they work hard to develop the market. Okay, for example, you have clearing houses, and they invest a lot in trying to create a market for bonds. They lobby a lot to take barriers for creating such a market down. So they have a positive effect, and at some point they enjoy the rents for the investment they made at the beginning. So we have to think about the whole chain of their activities.
Yeah. Hi, Kate. I would like you to address one specific point. Actually, reading your paper, it seems to me that there is actually a good a matter of antitrust problem here. There is antitrust issues in this situation, and it seems to me that there is a very delicate relationship between antitrust regulation and financial regulation and capital markets regulation. This is not the only point where this stress comes out. For example, there is one very important point related to banking concentration, and there's that discussion if you should make prevail the market and the competitiveness of the institutions, or the strength and effectiveness of the system. And we have the same situation here in Brazil related to stock exchanges, and our regulator had to discuss if it would be good or not to allow a second stock exchange in Brazil, when the problem was this lack of dialogue between antitrust law and securities regulation. And I would like you to address this point related to your paper.
Kate, you may not want more examples, but forgive me because I haven't read your paper, so maybe it's already there. But if you look in equities and the history of the National Market Act in 1975, and really finally Reg NMS not until 2002, you can on the one hand see it took a long time to create a system that would allow really effective competition for the New York Stock Exchange. But it did happen eventually, so it's interesting to figure out how and why it did happen, and the effects have been incredibly dramatic. I mean, the share of trading for the New York Stock Exchange now is about 20%, whereas 20 years ago it was something like 80%. So I think there's a very interesting political economy story there.
So I think it is somewhat related to Merritt's comments. So, you know, Kate, I like this project a lot. And I, by the way, maybe I just misunderstood. I only looked at this most recent draft quickly. I saw a previous draft that I'm largely reacting about. But my sense was that while you're focused on the fees and transaction costs that can arise as a result of intermediary influence, perhaps the bigger concern about their influence is that they might nudge us toward transactions or financial instruments that are not efficient, and this might lead to misallocation of capital writ large. And for me, when I read your paper, that strikes me as the overarching concern. So even if it's the case that the fees would be the same, that the amount of surplus that the industry would collect would be the same, a separate concern we could have would be, but for this influence that they have because of the expertise and the position they're in, we might get a more efficient set of transactions that we don't get. We might not get such complicated securities, as you pointed out in previous work, for example, or who knows. But that, to me, would be the bigger concern. It's kind of like in my own area when I write about executive compensation, people say, well, people are paid too much or too little. My reaction usually is, I don't really know, but I care a lot more about the performance alignment because that kind of mistake leads to big misallocation of capital and lost projects, and that's what you care more about. Anyway, that's what I thought your focus was, but I might be mistaken. So as usual, your pieces are always scary because they show us, I think, the underbelly of some things that I typically think are positive. So you have this paper that shows, well, banks exercise oversight of other banks, which could be good unless they all sit down and say, wouldn't it be great if we set this up so we all fail at the same time and then have the social subsidy, in which case it's terrifying. And also they're really smart, et cetera, so who knows, right? So here, I think what you've pointed out to me, and you just said it in the talk in a way I hadn't heard before, but it just clicked for me, we can think of SROs as a way to channel intermediary influence. And I like to think of SROs as quite positive. We have the stock exchange, you know, FINRA does good, yeah, it does good things. But when I hear you talk about it, I really think this paper has some important implications for both the governance of the SRO itself and then the way we want to think of overseeing the SRO. And you said two things there that I think is worth focusing on. First, if you look at a lot of SRO debates, the SROs will propose a rule and they'll go to the Securities Exchange Commission or whomever's overseeing them and say, look, this rule creates some winners, some losers in our SRO, so this shows you that we're being independent and careful about what we're proposing to you and you should approve it. And actually, the point you just made is that's not true at all. It depends on who the winners and losers are, because there might be disproportionate influence of certain intermediaries in the SRO. And if the winners are the ones with lots of influence and the losers are the ones who don't have lots of influence, that's a totally different story, and we might feel differently about such a proposal. For a second, I think all of this suggests that we should have pretty close regulatory oversight over what SROs are doing. And I can just tell you empirically, this is not the case. So there's a couple of papers recently that show that especially after Dodd-Frank, CFTC just rubber stamps the stuff that the commodities exchanges wants to do. The SEC is barely overseeing now what the exchanges are doing. And by the way, you know, the reason they do that is they have limited resources, limited expertise, and your story might make that a little troubling for us. And I don't think you have to take a position, SRO is good, SRO is bad. I think what you might be able to say is just, look, given these dynamics, regulators should look out for proposals that come out of the SROs that look like this, because it might reflect influence that's suboptimal.
I think I just want to make two comments on your presentation. I have to confess that I didn't get around to read your paper. But one is thinking about intermediaries maybe in a way that I have a hard time putting it, but it leads to my comparative point that I wanted to make. One way to think about, you know, deriving a theory is to think about a particular concrete setting in one jurisdiction and look at these institutions and then derive sort of generalizations from that, and then you want to test them elsewhere, right? But I think I take Vilhena's point to say, actually, if you just studied multiple settings and looked at different intermediaries in different settings, then we might even start developing a slightly richer theoretical framework within which to look at intermediaries from the get-go. And I think this would be, I mean, this kind of group or this kind of interaction that we have here might help us go in this direction. But even within the United States setting, I was sort of wondering whether it would be helpful to dissect or unbundle the intermediaries a little bit and think about the kind of functions that they provide. Sort of what is, dealer functions, broker functions, information or liquidity, what are their major contributions to these markets? I think a critical function is the market-making aspect that some of them do, and sometimes they really want to do this also, and they might be particularly good at that in markets that are not well developed yet, right? So this also might be a temporal but also scaling thing where intermediaries can legitimately perform certain functions, and at some point you want to make this actually more transparent and as accessible and create more competition over time, because you don't want them to capture the rents, which, however, for some really small and underdeveloped, unliquid markets, maybe we would like to give them. The final question that I had is sort of, I would like to know whether some of the intermediaries that you're studying actually double dip in terms of being at the same time within a self-regulatory regime and while also subjecting themselves to being subjected to public regulation, because you see this a lot, right? If you think about the entire derivative markets, OTC or non-OTC, it's the same big banks that issue the stuff that dabble in both markets and benefit a lot from having them next to one another. So there's even a more complex story potentially here, where on the one hand you're trying to influence regulators, but you're also saying, okay, we'll make a concession. You pretend that you're making a concession to self-regulation, while at the same time creating one niche that you can then use for certain types of transactions, while at the same time you still have this other market that you can I don't know, hedge in or double dip in more general terms. Thanks.
All right. So there's a lot there. So thank you all, particularly Vilhena, for the rich comments. I will just kind of touch on some of them. So clearly you're right. You could look far broader than the U.S., and I think Kathryn is right too. There's real value in doing that. I mean, right now, and again, even within this paper, I actually look at very different types of marketplaces. So I look at everything from real estate, and I look at intermediaries playing all kinds of different roles. I think there's clearly a role for going further, and I think also you are entirely correct that if you look there, you will also see intermediary influence, even though it will become manifest in slightly different ways. Because I think not only are banks operating in different jurisdictions, but they understand now that they want to kind of influence the rules at IOSCO, at Basel, if they want to be able to have certain benefits in different areas. And I think actually even some of the debates among nations are being influenced by influence on intermediaries in their jurisdiction, getting them to lobby in particular directions. So I think you will still see this, even though you're right, it will become manifest in slightly different ways. And actually your other point that you said right at the beginning, that this is not the biggest issue here, I should also be clear, I don't think this is the biggest issue in the US. I really think that in some ways it's actually in some ways small. Like, I think part of the reason this hasn't received a lot of attention is oftentimes because there are such benefits that arise, and this kind of goes to the normative points that Rob was raising, there are such benefits that arise from our reliance on specialized intermediaries, because there are actually even at times where we want them to enjoy some rents to encourage certain types of investment or ex ante, that we actually haven't looked that closely at this. And so part of my point is that, look, in any of the individual contexts, the effects might be small. Nonetheless, they end up being quite significant if we think about this more broadly. And because, again, they're not just distributionable, but we actually are increasing transaction fees in a way that's inhibiting otherwise value-creating transactions from going forward, that we ought to start thinking about this when we're doing things like thinking about allocating limited regulatory resources. Again, going back to your things, and one of the things I should make clear, if it wasn't already clear in the paper, is that when I talk about high fee arrangements, I really am using that as a shorthand. So I'm not just talking about an arrangement where they get necessarily higher fees than they do in other environments. That clearly was true in Trace, it's clear with tick sizes and some of the examples I use. But I think another way that intermediary influence becomes manifest is in the tendency to favor environments that result in you having to rely on the intermediary. So one of the greatest ways to kind of entrench a long-term revenue stream, which is really what I mean, is institutional arrangements that maximize long-term revenues, is rather than allowing parties to have ways of getting around you, you're forcing parties to go through you. So that is also what I consider kind of a high fee arrangement. So I think when I use that term, I mean to use it broadly for things that maximize long-term revenues of the intermediaries involved in ways that might have kind of socially troubling costs. actually moving to your comment, I think it was one of the things that you said was really interesting. You said if there's $1 billion on the table, then why wouldn't somebody come in? Because for $1 billion, you think it'd be worth it. And it'd be true if they knew there was $1 billion on the table. And this is one of the things that I think is interesting, the more I really start to delve into these different examples, is I think there's very significant complementarities among these different forces. So yeah, there was collective action, but there were also these huge information asymmetries. And I don't think people knew how big the rents were. And so if they knew, okay, well, we're going to get $1 billion here, they might have been able to devise something. But there was a combination of not knowing for sure what the effect was going to be, figuring it's probably going to go a particular direction, but not knowing the magnitude, combined with the other things that I'm talking about, that I think allowed them, again, not forever to have the opaque system in place, but I think much longer than an efficient, than would have been appropriate in light of the viability of this more efficient arrangement. In terms of the antitrust enforcement, I completely agree. That I think is actually one of the key takeaways, which I don't think comes out as a single takeaway. But there is, and I don't know how it operates here, but in the U.S., a very strong, both tendency, but at times it's embedded into the law, at times it's not, where you have industries that are otherwise regulated, antitrust authorities tend to shy away and allow their primary regulator to play more of the role. And as you're pointing out, oftentimes intermediaries that I'm interested in are otherwise regulated, banks and securities dealers and the like. What I'm drawing attention to is actually that's where we potentially need the most antitrust enforcement, because to the extent they are engaging in things that are like collusion, there are actually welfare effects beyond just kind of the collection of monopoly rents that we need to be worried about. So I think part of what I'm trying to draw attention to is actually it's this area where we tend to have, for structural reasons, what I might consider potential under-enforcement, potentially greater enforcement. And yet, again, we see the regulators a little hesitant to jump in because they're also afraid, and I think going back to the point about the information, there are collateral consequences that they don't fully understand. And I think if you have a system that's working, and then you have one that you think is going to be a little bit more efficient, people are very hesitant to go in and mandate those changes when you have really informed market participants saying, oh, something really scary is going to happen if you make this change. And I think that's a really common dynamic. But I think your point about the antitrust is actually key. And I think for me, one of the target audiences is actually those who focus on competition policy and trying to draw their attention to even subtle forms of collusion, even if they don't necessarily rise to legal arrangements, or suggesting that antitrust authorities ought to speak more to the primary regulators and say, look, here are the things you potentially want to look at. Here are indicia that there might be something troubling going on that might or might not arise to the level of an antitrust violation, but nonetheless could lead to costs that we normally associate with collusive behavior. And so I think that is merit has a
I was just going to say, I mean, it's not just the regulators, it's the courts themselves have bought in, we've had cases about whether underwriters, the arrangements that underwriters have is a violation of the antitrust laws, and the courts basically just said, well, this is a regulated area, and we need to keep our hands off because it's just too complicated. It's just not, we can't just, blindly apply the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act.
Which is, I think that's a perfect point. I'll try and keep the rest really brief. I mean, I guess just also, one of the things that I think indirectly was you were hinting at, Merit, is that we did eventually see change in terms of the monopoly historically enjoyed by the New York Stock Exchange. And I think that's actually common in a lot of what I'm talking about. So at times we actually see the creation of institutional arrangements that are troubling. More often it is the entrenchment. And again, I think this is one of the reasons this dynamic has been overlooked, because we're like, oh, we get change eventually, so why worry about it all that much? But you could say the same thing in antitrust. I mean, every kind of collusive arrangement eventually falls apart. Nonetheless, we spend a huge amount of time looking at it because there's significant costs in the interim. And so I think those interim costs can be quite significant. And I also agree, while it's probably beyond the scope of this paper, that what you're hinting at is understanding what are the institutional environments that then lead to degradation and allow a more innovative approach to come in or a more efficient arrangement to arise is one of the areas where I think that we clearly need kind of further study. And I think an implication is that we need to figure out why this eventually changes, and looking at situations where it has, I think is a a good way to go. I think, Rob, you summarized actually part of what I was saying beautifully, so I very much appreciate that. And I also liked your point about SROs and your point about the underbelly, because I think it is a common theme in much of my work, and it's also true here. I mean, I'm not saying let's get rid of intermediaries or that intermediaries are bad, and I think some people feel like that's what I'm saying. And there's just incredible efficiencies that arise from our reliance on specialized intermediaries, so I don't see them going away, nor do I think they should go away anytime soon. Nonetheless, we're making the decision to rely on specialized intermediaries at time A because there's advantages that arise, and a lot of the strategic advantages in particular that I'm talking about, the informational and the positional advantages, they arise and they also get a lot deeper over time. And so their ability to use these advantages in some problematic ways. And the funny thing is, these advantages are precisely what allow them to create the efficiencies that they do, right? So it's because they understand the market so well. It's because they understand the product so well that it's that much easier if we want to buy something or if we want to deal in something, that it's easier to go to an intermediary who's processed all that information, who we trust for reputational reasons to be able to kind of verify the accuracy of that information than trying to do it ourselves. So I mean, even the advantages that I talk about in troubling ways in the paper, I actually think arise from very healthy market forces, which is that increases kind of the gains that we can enjoy from our reliance. And I was trying to draw attention, and I think underbelly is one way to put it, that there are also costs. And going back to the final point, I think that then also relates to the role of regulators, and I think part of what we are talking about here is merely greater scrutiny, and I agree with you. I mean, so it's not necessarily saying, like, let's jump in, but there's, I think, a whole variety of areas where being a little more aggressive and a little quicker to second guess, and yeah, allowing some of the natural tendency of courts along with regulators when they're uncertain to defer, to potentially actually should be pushing in the opposite direction, particularly if you're looking at an environment where these factors look like they really are potentially all operative. So kind of these, I think, also another way to look at these factors are indicia of situations where we need greater scrutiny. So thank you all.